Welcome to Science on Tap. Welcome to spring, finally. My name is Susan Knight. I work at UW Trout Lake Station up the road a bit. And I want to thank you all for coming on such a nice spring evening. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. We started Science on Tap not so that you would hear a lecture, but so that you would hear different topics on science and you could ask your own questions and learn something. I'd like to thank our partners in Science on Tap. That's UW Trout Lake Station, where I work, also UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, part of College of Ag and Life Sciences, the Lakeland Badger Chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, the Minocqua Public Library, and our host here, the Minocqua Brewing Company. So thanks to all of our sponsors. And we are largely funded by a grant from the Brittingham Foundation, so we appreciate that as well. And just a reminder that there are 4 ways to watch. You can come and join us right here, which is always the best. You can also go to the library, Minocqua Public Library, and watch it with Mary Taylor. We also routinely have this being live streamed from the Eagle River Library, if you're from that part of the county. And you can always watch from home. We have live streaming over a YouTube channel, and you can watch it from your own home if you have good enough internet. And then we archive all of our presentations, and we have the full presentation, and then we also have an 8 to 10 minute short. Those come out maybe a month or so after the original presentation. So lots of different ways to watch. And I want to say that our next Science on Tap, our speaker will be Larry Mueller of Wisconsin Public Radio fame. I'm sure many of you know him. And so that'll be fun. That'll be our last one of the year. We are also, I want to do a quick announcement that we are going to have a field trip in the fall, in September. And I'll announce it again at the June Science on Tap. But it will be September 15th. It's a Saturday. And the field trip will be at Kemp, and we'll be talking about wetlands. So I'll give you another reminder about that, and be sure to sign up for our email reminders. You'll get an email about that. I also, since that field trip will be at Kemp, but there are also lots of other events happening at Kemp this summer, and we have some flyers in the back, and there are discovery walks at, or there are different outreach programs at Kemp. And I want to make sure you know about one that's coming up this Saturday, May 5th, 7 a.m. So it is Discover the Birds of Kemp Station, led by David Drake from UW-Madison. And please bring binoculars, and there will be a rain date of the next day, Sunday, if the weather is really bad. So anyway, Saturday, May 5th, 7 a.m., discover the birds at Kemp Station and pick up a flyer in the back of the room. All right. So tonight, we are fortunate to have Dr. Scott Walter. Scott grew up pretty typical farm, small-town kid in rural southern Wisconsin. Stand up for a second. You might think he spent his youth playing basketball, but he did not. He was a future wildlife ecologist, so of course he spent his time camping and hunting and fishing and bird watching and that kind of thing. He graduated from Beloit College in 1990 with a degree in biology, and after a few years doing seasonal work, he started graduate school. He earned both a master's degree and a Ph.D. from UW-Madison Wildlife Ecology. After graduating, he was on the faculty at UW-Richland, where he developed a natural resources program and funneled many students up to UW-Stevens Point. He maintains close relationships with many of those students, many of whom now have careers in conservation in Wisconsin and beyond. Though he enjoyed teaching, he wanted more engagement in wildlife conservation, and he moved to the Wisconsin DNR in 2011, where he served through 2015 as the upland wildlife ecologist and farm bill specialist. But then he had 2 years as the director of conservation programs for the Ruffed Grouse Society. This guy has a lot of talents. And earlier this year, just a few months ago, he went back to the Wisconsin DNR as the large carnivore specialist, where he works with partners on management related to bears, wolves, and cougars. When not working, he can be found on his 6th-generation family farm with his wife and 5 children in Richland County. Here's your trivia question for Scott Walter. For such an obviously smart guy, Scott has some less than intelligent moments. All right, so here's an example. Scott was working in the tundra up in the Arctic, having adventures with wildlife. One night, while sleeping in a cabin, he heard a noise, and he wondered, what could that be? Running through the list of animals common in the Arctic tundra, he thought it was probably a polar bear. So what did he do? A, he opened the door, walked outside in his socks, looked up, saw it was a bear, yelled at it. It was not intimidated. B, figuring it might be a bear, he found his stash of firecrackers, lit a couple, threw them up on the roof, set the roof on fire, but at least the bear ran away. Or C, he was worried it might be a bear, so he jumped off his bed in a semi-panic, forgetting he was zipped up in his sleeping bag, jammed the zipper, flopped around on the floor, doing his best impersonation of a seal, hoping like heck the bear did not fall through the roof. You're right. Scott.
Thank you. So I can tell I provided Sue way too long of an introduction. Makes my life seem more exciting than it has been. But I think the underlying theme there is simply I can't hold a job. But really excited to be here tonight. When I got the invitation, it was mentioned that this was going to be held at the brewing company here. And coming from Richland County, when I heard brewing company, I thought bar, and I thought I'd be squeezed back behind a pool table with a pitcher of beer in front of me. So this is wonderful. This is really something. Very nice. So, as Sue mentioned, I began my new career as a large carnivore specialist with the Wisconsin DNR just 3 short months ago. And it's interesting. We're all here. Why? Because we're passionate about wildlife. You're certainly not here to listen to or meet Scott Walter. You're here because the topic that we're going to be discussing and exchanging some thoughts about tonight is of interest to you. We're very fortunate to live in Wisconsin, where we've got this rich, very diverse wildlife community. And the species now that I engage with, I'll say cougar, not cougars, cougar, black bears, and of course gray wolves are very interesting species to many people. But one of the things that attracted me to this position is the fact that they're contentious species. And I don't think I step over any lines by saying that, right? Especially when it comes to things like gray wolves, people have strong opinions. As somebody steeped in wildlife management, it's the career I chose after all. I want to do good things for wildlife. Part of the thing that attracted me to this job is I knew the public was passionate about these critters. The death knell for wildlife and our ability to manage for healthy wildlife populations is public disinterest, right? But I knew when it came to gray wolves, there was going to be anything but disinterest. And I do know that people live on this end of the spectrum and this end of the spectrum when it comes to how we manage things like gray wolves, but they are engaged, they are passionate, they have a point of view, and as long as people are willing to express that point of view, we can have open discourse and we can chart a course for wolves, bears, and cougar into the future here in Wisconsin. So those are the 3 species I manage, and to extend that thought just a little bit, Sue mentioned my background. Like every other kid you'll meet in rural Wisconsin, I hunted, I fished, became very interested and passionate about wildlife. That propelled me into a career in the wildlife field. And I had smooth sailing early on, teaching at a small UW campus. My first stint with the DNR, managing upland game birds primarily, working for the Ruffed Grouse Society. So what do you think when it was announced that I had moved over to this position? What do you think the response was amongst my friends and colleagues. What in the HE double toothpicks were you thinking? But again, you know, my rationale was simple. People care about these species. They're certainly important as members of our wildlife community. There are impacts, human impacts felt by some of these species in terms of livestock depredations, crop depredations, for example, with black bears. So these are issues that are important to people, and I'm really proud to be back with the DNR and working with our partners to chart a course into the future for these critters. Just to touch base on a couple things you've seen recently in the newspaper. Who saw on YouTube or Facebook or wherever the video of the cougar popping up on the window down in Brookfield? In March of this year, we had a confirmed cougar, right? The DNR, I want to say that again. The DNR confirmed the presence of a cougar in Wisconsin. We don't out of hand deny these sightings, but we do demand some evidence, some support for these sightings before we confirm them. I want to talk about that cougar for just a minute because its presence down in a heavily populated part of the state really brought out, I think, sort of some cultural issues that are at the heart of large carnivore management in general. When people heard that there was a cougar confirmed in that part of the state, my week was done. The phone didn't stop ringing. The media was very interested. Every news channel, every newspaper had a story about this one single individual cougar who was really doing nothing but wandering around looking for a deer to jump on and eat. Our local biologist, Diane Robinson, in 2 days' time fielded 145 inquiries. Okay? So why the interest? Well, obviously, cougars are large carnivores. So like other large carnivores, people are going to react strongly. Sometimes fear, sometimes love and adoration, but really nothing in the middle. There are, again, these strong feelings. But what it spelled out to me, and again, we could attach this same sort of historical process to any of these species, we're seeing the leading edge of range expansion by cougars that was allowed given our evolving conservation ethic. All these species back in the 1800s, early 1900s, were vilified as vermin. There were predator control programs. People were hell-bent on eradicating these species because during the days of manifest destiny and westward expansion, they were impediments to progress, right? So if you look at any of these species, 1960, wolves were gone from Wisconsin. The only population of wolves left in the lower 48 state were a few hundred wolves in northern Minnesota. Cougars had been pushed up into the remotest parts of the Rocky Mountains and some areas of the Southwest in the 48. Black bear numbers were much lower and much more isolated in distribution than they are today. So when you see something like gray wolf range expansion, and I know there are issues attached to gray wolves in the state. We can talk about them. When you hear about, for gosh sakes, a mountain lion occurring in southeast Wisconsin, understand that that's something that's occurred given our changing philosophies about wildlife and our changing management ethics with regards to their potential place in the ecosystem. So you step back, you take a big picture view. This large carnivore community was gone from the state for all intents and purposes a half century ago. Now we've got a healthy wolf population, an extremely healthy black bear population that supports a lot of enthusiastic bear hunters out there, and we've even got the odd cougar showing up in the state. But the question related to cougars, because there's been a lot of recent interest, do we have a breeding population in the state? The answer is not as far as we know, and likely not. And if you're interested in that cougar, we can talk about why not, and why we're not likely to have a breeding population in the near future as you'd like. But wolves, just to touch base with wolves, we're essentially, over the last 15 years, in the middle of a wolf tennis match. They're on the endangered species list, they're off the endangered species list, they're on the endangered species list, they're off the endangered species list. That is a fundamental to our efforts to address human-wolf conflicts and some of the issues that crop up with wolves is their federal status. Because, and this is fundamental, when wolves are listed on the federal endangered species list, the Wisconsin DNR does not have management authority for wolves. We still engage, we've still got a very vigorous population monitoring program, but in terms of deciding how many wolves we want, where we want them, in terms of addressing conflicts, hunting dogs that are killed by wolves, livestock losses, we really have very limited recourse to address those issues. And I'm sure we'll talk about wolves more as we go through the night, but the last thing I want to leave you with is a question on everybody's mind, 6'7". It's what my whole life, that's all anybody ever asked me. How tall are you? 6'7". But I know part of this this event, this get-together, is allowing you folks to engage in the discussion and bring issues that are of interest or importance in your neck of the woods relative to this really cool wildlife community. So I'll open her up.
Hi. I've always thought it would be an easy solution to take problem wolves from Wisconsin and let them go on Isle Royale. And has anybody considered this, and what is the thinking on it?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is translocation of individual animals when perhaps they become an issue. Say a wolf pack starts to depredate livestock. The idea might be let's live capture them, let's not euthanize them or kill them, let's take them someplace else. Translocation is an option that we exploit heavily in black bear management. If there's a black bear that's causing problems, crop depredations, it's getting into a cornfield, or it's at a campground digging through garbage, we work with our federal partners at APHIS, USDA APHIS Wildlife Services. They'll trap and translocate that animal, hopefully solving the local problem, but keeping that bear on the landscape here in Wisconsin to help support, you know, our very vigorous bear hunting pastime. Now, in terms of Isle Royale, anybody followed that story over the last few years? So Isle Royale was colonized by moose. Everybody know Isle Royale? If you think of Lake Superior as a wolf's head, it's the eye. It's that big island. It's close to Minnesota, but it's actually part of Michigan. But in the 1930s, moose made it out to the island. And I'll talk about this story because it's a classic case of predator-prey dynamics. And we learned a lot about how wolves and their prey interact by studying Isle Royale. And I'm sorry, I'll get to your question specifically, but I have a habit of going off on tangents. So this is a sign. If I'm going too far off on a tangent, somebody just go like this and I'll steer her back to the answer. But in the 1930s, moose colonized Isle Royale. It was a hard winter. They made it across on the ice, but there were no natural predators for moose on the island at that time. So what happened, we've got this large herbivore with unlimited food. Moose numbers shot upward. But what happened when they had outstripped their food sources, a hard winter came, they crashed. So moose populations on Isle Royale became very chaotic, very eruptive with periods of population growth followed by crashes. That continued until about 1954-55, when apparently a pair of wolves, luckily a male and a female, another hard winter, they made it out to the island. And thus began Isle Royale's wolf population and this cool and well-studied wolf population dynamic. And initially what was seen as the wolf population increased, they had all these moose to eat, moose dynamics leveled off, right? Moose didn't crash, wolves didn't drive them down, but they were able to help regulate this moose population. Because the wolf population was founded by just two individuals likely, though, eventually issues related to genetic diversity, inbreeding became paramount, and we're to the point right now where we're about to lose that wolf population after 64, 65 years. They're on their way out. So there's been this debate. Those of you who followed this it's Isle Royale, it's a national park. Should we intervene with this natural process and restock the island with wolves? I see the values, the benefits on both sides. If we don't, then moose are going to begin this very chaotic population dynamic again, likely. There's going to be impacts on the vegetation, on other species. But if we do, we're interfering again in this park-like environment. So it's something the Fish and Wildlife Service has really been struggling with. And did they come to resolution on that recently? I saw they are going to put wolves. They'll probably not be from Wisconsin. At least I haven't been contacted about anybody wanting wolves, but yeah, it sounds like they're eventually going to be back there. We do not translocate wolves in Wisconsin, even though our options are limited now because they're federally listed. When we have a problem wolf, it's euthanized, okay, if we're able to exert that authority.
Question here?
Yep.
I had heard there's 12 wolves that are supposed to be put out there.
Do you know where they're coming from?
No, I don't. A question about the cougar. I have heard, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I have heard that all the cougar that migrate through the state here are basically from the Mount Rushmore area. And that has been proven through DNA samples. And they are basically only males. That's why we don't have a breeding population. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So if you hearken back to my earlier comments about cougars during the era of westward expansion being pushed up into isolated pockets in the Rocky Mountains, the last 50 years, development of a conservation ethic, establishment of regulated harvest seasons. Cougars, like wolves, are expanding their range. They've now colonized western South Dakota, the Black Hills area, western North Dakota. If you've been to Teddy Roosevelt National Park, there's a cougar population there, and also in the sandhills of western Nebraska, there's a cougar population. The closest to us is the Black Hills, but it's about 600 miles away. Now, what I'm going to say with respect to this cougar is critically important, and sir, you're exactly right. We're 600 miles away from the nearest breeding population of mountain lions, pumas, cougars. Male cougars, when they get to the age of about 2, a lot of research to support this, they disperse, and sometimes incredibly long distances. We've had confirmed, the DNR has confirmed cougars in Wisconsin, 7 out of the last 8 years, in many of those years, multiple cougars. They're all likely males, and we've been able to collect genetic material from, I think, 5 or 6 of those animals. They all harken back to the Black Hills. One of those males was eventually killed 2 or 3 months after we found it here in Connecticut. Right? If you may remember that, 2011, 2012. I mean, you think about it, when I was 15, 16 years old, if that girl I liked wasn't at this playground, I was going to find her at that one or at the gas station. I was going to keep going until I found Debbie Pash. This is being recorded. Debbie's going to see this. My wife is going to kill me. So these males are going to keep moving, right, until they find a female. But, and here's what is important for people to understand who worry about the presence of that one cougar, indicating cougars are going to be all over the place soon. Female cougars, only about half of them disperse at all. About half the young females establish a breeding territory near their mothers. So they're staying in the Black Hills. Those that disperse don't disperse as far. The furthest recorded dispersal movement by a female cougar is about 250 miles. We're 600 miles from the Black Hills. Females won't disperse as far as we know, much farther than 250 miles. It's not going to get a female cougar here. Not saying it can't happen, right? But the likelihood is pretty low. However, once we hear about a breeding cougar population in the intervening area, like say northern Minnesota, It's inevitable. At some point, we're going to have a breeding cougar population here in Wisconsin. Be that 5 years, 50 years, I don't know. But
Could you just give us a quick summary of the numbers of wolves and management scenarios going on right now in Wisconsin? Same thing for black bears, please.
sure.
Thanks.
So we're just putting together, Jane Wiedenhoft, who's one of our staff people who really coordinates the wolf monitoring activities, has done a wonderful job for many, many years, is putting together the summary of this past winter's wolf monitoring program. So to monitor wolves, we go out during the winter months. Our staff, when I say we, I mean some DNR staff, but predominantly volunteers. Citizens interested in wolves partake in our population assessment efforts, our midwinter wolf count. So they go out in the winter with good snow conditions, and they track established blocks of habitat, try to identify the presence of wolves, how many are in that pack. We essentially summarize that and develop a midwinter estimate. It's a minimum count, of course, because we're counting them in the winter, right? Last year, we had 926 to 954 wolves, so somewhere, say 1,000, about 1,000 wolves. You backtrack from that, it's just like going down a slide, right? We're at the tail end of some pretty significant population growth. You go back to the year I graduated from high school and was still chasing Debbie Pash around. We had 14 wolves in the state, 1986. So you just think of those two numbers. There's been pretty significant wolf population growth. Having talked to Jane recently, these numbers haven't been released. I won't tell you any numbers, but it looks like when you see the numbers from this most recent winter, we're leveling off, which is sort of expected, right? With a wildlife population, you get that S-shaped growth curve. But in terms of management, again, how we manage wolves is heavily dependent on their federal status. Right now, we really have no way to regulate wolf numbers. But, well, did you guys follow the federal budget discussions just a couple months ago, the federal omnibus funding bill? Should have. It kept the government funded through September, right? Those bills, both the House and Senate versions, until the night before the president signed the bill, had language in it that would have delisted the gray wolf segment in the upper Great Lakes region, our wolves. And I was expecting to be very, 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 very busy. In fact, I didn't go to a meeting in Kentucky because I thought, boy, the phone's going to be ringing off the hook. Folks are going to be calling up to ask about wolves. It got pulled out. It was used sort of politically as a bargaining chip as they were trying to figure out how to zero into a final bill package, and wolves weren't delisted. But, and I don't see any of these yet. I think I'm still on track. But when we resume management authority, when wolves are delisted, then it's all on us. That is going to be a very challenging period in the life of Scott Walter, because we've got to answer some really significant questions and then implement a management strategy. And the questions are things like, how many wolves do we want in Wisconsin? Where do we want them? We answer those questions by engaging our partners. We have a committee devoted to developing a wolf management plan, and on that committee are DNR staff, but also representatives from a lot of different groups, farming groups, agricultural groups, advocacy groups, so they can provide input. Does that mean it's going to be easy? No, because again, when it comes to wolves, 0 is the goal. Let them do what they want is the goal. There are people on both extremes. So that's going to be my fun job, is to try to figure out how to arrive at a goal that we can all live with.
And the bears?
With respect to black bears, yep. With respect to black bears, right now our population's 25,000, give or take. It's a lot of black bears, most of them up north. I think Sue mentioned I'm living on my family farm, 6th-generation family farm in Richland County. We're seeing more and more bears down there, right? Bears are expanding their range, primarily into the southwestern part of the state, but somewhat to the southeast as well. At least we've got dispersing individuals showing up. So we've got about 25,000 bears. That population supports a really, really, really popular sport hunt, right? We've got the 2018 bear drawing was conducted a few months ago. We had 124,000 people apply for either preference points or harvest permits for this fall's bear season. So it's a very popular activity. The problem from my point of view, I shouldn't say problem, one of the things that we have to deal with, black bears have relatively low reproductive potential for a couple of reasons. Litter sizes are relatively low, 2 to 4 cubs usually, right? Average 2.5 to 3 cubs, but females only breed every other year, right? They hang on to those cubs through a second winter. So growth rates aren't that great. When we've got a lot of people wanting to get out and pursue black bears, we've got 25,000 bears with limited growth potential. We've got to make sure we're only leaking out a number of tags that the population can sustain. We're only harvesting so many bears, right? So black bear management brings with it all kinds of really interest. Again, it's the reason I took this job, trying to work toward those types of answers is really appealing. I don't know, does that answer?
Another question? Oh.
I can't believe I mentioned Debbie Pash. 3 times. Can we edit this?
To what extent do you think the bear population, the expanding bear population, affects deer population?
The expanding bear population.
How it affects white-tailed deer population in the state?
I'm going to stand up for this answer. So you've brought up an issue that I knew would come up and is very near and dear to my heart. Predator impacts on prey animals. There are concerns about the impacts of wolves on white-tailed deer. There are concerns about the impacts of bear on white-tailed deer. Bear are a predator. They're an omnivore. We all know that. Throughout the year, most of their diet consists of plant matter, but in the spring, they will actively search out for newborn fawns. And until those fawns are mobile, black bears will feed on them. So they do have an impact. The question is, and this is why this is such an important issue to me, the question is, does that limit deer population growth? As a population ecologist, it's a very difficult question to answer, right? Because any wildlife population is influenced by lots of factors. Winter weather, certainly important for deer, disease, food availability, harvest pressure by us, how many doe tags we give out, and predators, roadkill, all these things combine to influence deer numbers through time. So you ask me, what relative importance does black bear predation have? Very difficult to assess, but if you view it in the context of all the things driving deer numbers, it's probably not the big thing. However, when you combine black bear predation on fawns with predation by wolves, you can have an appreciable impact on deer numbers. And we can get into predator-prey systems if you have any questions about things like white-tailed deer in more detail. But the thing you want to remember is it's always more complex than people initially assume. It's almost, and I've run into this many times throughout my career, it's almost a knee-jerk reaction. When a wildlife population dips, the general public blames what? Predators. Way too simplistic of an answer. Let me throw some data out. Who's aware of the incredibly interactive data set we have on our website? Deer Metrics. Anybody played with that? This is I think it's one of the greatest things our agency has done recently. Kevin Wallenfang, my colleague, great idea, did a great job putting this together. I think he deserves a lot of credit. But you can go in there, click on your county, and see the population estimates and the harvest statistics for that county over the last dozen plus years. And what we see in the northern forests generally has been an increase in the deer harvest for the last 4 to 5 years. In fact, last year's buck harvest was the highest it's been in 10 years. Okay? So again, that doesn't explain how are wolves impacting deer, but it's an indication, at least over the last few years, they haven't been limiting white-tailed deer population growth. Okay?
We have a question online with Susan.
Hang on a second. This is a question from the library, and there's somebody in the audience over there. This is the Minocqua Public Library who saw a cougar and was not able to photograph it, and she's wondering if you can comment on how many cougar have been confirmed in northern Wisconsin.
In northern Wisconsin, none so far this year, and by this year I mean 2018. In 2017, there was a cougar, the middle part of the year, I don't remember the month, in Douglas County. It showed up again. It or another cougar showed up again and was confirmed in Lincoln and Langlade County, in that neighborhood. There was a cougar down in my neck of the woods in Jackson County that was confirmed. And then late in the year, we started to see cougar activity in Fond du Lac County, and probably that individual moved early this year into the southeast part of the state and showed up. Now, one other comment I'd make, so we get lots of phone calls, emails, reports of cougar sightings. Understand that, again, we need confirmation, because people claiming they saw a cougar does not make it a cougar in our eyes, unless there's some evidence. A photograph of a track with a ruler sitting next to it that allows us to identify it as a cougar, a photograph from a trail camera that shows the cougar, some evidence like that. And it's difficult sometimes one-on-one to tell a person, I don't believe you, or that's not a cougar. But you'd be pretty amazed, I think, to see the photographs of bobcats, coyotes, house cats that show up from people who firmly believe that's a cougar. And, you know, God bless them for sending the report in. But I think oftentimes the DNR develops a reputation as deniers. We're trying to hide something. We're rejecting the fact there are cougars in the state. It's not the case, but we want to make sure that we're reflecting what's actually out there. So, and if you look at a trail camera photograph taken in the middle of the night and it shows an obvious cat, it's sort of grayscale and slightly blurry, you can see half the animal, you can tell it's a cat. It's often the size. We need some sort of size perspective. So a great thing to do if you see a photograph like that is go out there with a yardstick or something of known size, just take another picture, and we can tell really easily if it's a cougar or something smaller.
You mentioned translocation as a way to manage problem bears. Have you used Carillion bear dogs ever?
Not as far as I'm aware. Describe those.
Pretty cool. I don't know if you've seen videos of them. Chase them up trees and basically keep them away, you know, and manage them.
Yeah. Dogs have been used, of course, to not just bears, but to chase a variety of wildlife from areas where they're causing problems. But it's sort of a temporary fix, right? That dogs are moved and the bear comes out of the tree and is still in that area and potentially causing problems. But yeah, there are a lot of neat techniques, many non-lethal techniques that can be used to address those issues.
One of my daughters lives just south of Lake Tomahawk, and her backyard is American Legion State Forest. The reason why I bring that up, she has 5 goats, and she has an incredibly strong enclosure around them. There must be wolves in the area. They've only seen a red fox who's hung around a couple times, but a lot of deer around. Is there anything she can do to minimize the possibility of having a problem?
So she's got, you say,
These goats, incidentally, are 150 to 200 pounds. They're big guys.
those are huge goats.
Yeah.
But she's got them in a very,
Strong enclosure.
when you say strong,
Well, it's like equivalent to railroad tie posts and really heavy duty. I think they only go up to about 6 feet.
so it's
The fencing.
woven wire or welded wire
Right.
fence. It's not barbed wire. I think they're, from wolves, she's good,
Okay.
right? There are other things you can do if wolves or if livestock are out on pasture, say with barbed wire or less rigid fencing. guard animals, right? Dogs, donkeys, things like that can be. But I think she's good if she's got a high fence that's woven like that. Yeah.
So where wolves are living in closer, I'll use the word closer, proximity to humans, has there been any kind of acclimation where they're sort of losing their fear of the presence of humans?
That's a really, really good question. So yes, there have been instances where wolves start to behave as though they're not afraid of people. They'll hang out in developed areas. Upon approach by a person, they won't show any sign of fear or wariness. Oftentimes that can be used as a sign of a problem wolf, and in many cases those wolves will be euthanized if they're considered to be a threat to human safety. Right now there's a wolf pack hanging out south of Superior. There's a large park on the south side of Superior. Some of you may be aware of it. The wolves are using that as part of their home range, but of course they're right on the edge of the city of Superior. And it sort of stands to reason that the more time any animal species spends smelling people, seeing people, in the presence of people with no negative interactions, the more tolerant they become. Acclimation, right? At what point that becomes problematic is a case-by-case decision that has to be made. But there's a school of thought that suggests that a harvest, right? One of the benefits of having the ability to harvest wolves is it maintains, to some extent, their wild nature. I'm not aware of a lot of data to support that, but I know it's sort of a pervasive thought you run into, that harvest keeps wolves and other wildlife wild.
Do you collar or track any of the animals, especially like the problem ones, to keep an eye on where they're going and what they're doing?
Yeah, every year we do. In fact, we're going to be kicking these efforts off here this year pretty soon. But every year we do go out and trap a relatively small number of wolves and put radio collars on them. And these are the cool gizmos. When I started in wildlife, if you put a radio tag on an animal, you had to get out into the field with a receiver and antenna. These are GPS collars, right? So the data is recorded on the collar and it can be sent to your office by even a cell phone signal, but a satellite relay, which honestly sucks. As a wildlife biologist, right? You want to get out there. But that's another very important component of our wolf monitoring efforts, because by locating those individual collared wolves repeatedly, first of all, we learn something about mortality. What's killing these wolves? The collars will tell us when the wolf has been stationary for a period of time, indicating it's died. We can go in and see if it's been hit by a car, been illegally harvested, had disease, whatever. But we also learn about the range that pack is occupying. So we learn quite a bit about sort of the spatial arrangement and the spatial needs of individual wolves that allows us to extrapolate to estimates of population size. Can I follow that up? Where's Ron? Ron Schultz. Where's Ron? That gentleman has probably trapped and collared more wolves in Wisconsin than anybody. Yep.
You know, I'd like to think that most of the decisions that you make are based on the science behind the management of these animals, but we also know that society, non-scientific people also have a great deal of influence on the decisions that you make, and I'm just wondering how much of a battle that becomes at times to try to balance between the scientific decisions that are often in conflict with the people who are deer hunters or whatever, who think that they know a lot about what they're doing, but may not necessarily know that much.
Okay, so you're trying to get me fired. I know that now. But it's a great question, and it's a question that's of significant personal interest to me. What I've learned, just say this, and again, if I go too far off, when I got into wildlife, because I love being in the woods, I love putting my hands on animals. I love hunting. I love the wind in my face. I love getting sunburned. I love cutting wood, a chainsaw. I love being out there. That's why I got into wildlife. What I've learned over the past 25 years or so, I can have the biggest impact on the animals I care about by working with people, by communicating, by talking about the scientific basis for our management decisions, by relating what we know about predator-prey systems, for example, by relating what we know about the potential impact of any management decision we make. And I've come to really appreciate you folks, right? People as much as squirrels. Don't take that the wrong way. I love squirrels. Now, but you're exactly right. It's the decisions that people make that decide how we're going to manage wolves, cougars, squirrels, whatever in the state. And you get into that interface between science, public opinion, politics, whatever you want to call it. And it can get frustrating because you see sometimes decisions that aren't made perhaps based solely on science. But I would argue that's not always necessarily the wrong thing, because for species like some of the critters in my program right now, there are direct impacts. And we've got to listen to the folks who are feeling those impacts. I mentioned this earlier, but I was at a meeting with representatives from the Farm Bureau, Wisconsin Cattlemen's Association, in Medford a month and a half ago, and I was talking with the folks who have lost cattle to wolves. I was talking with a young farmer. He and his wife are trying to raise kids on a 100-cow dairy. They've had wolves push their cows through a fence. They've lost wolves. They've altered their production system. Instead of putting those cows out on pasture, now they're confining those animals, their young stock, bringing the feed to them. He said it costs us about $30,000 extra per year to keep and that's the way they've responded to the presence. Is there science there? That's a social issue. That's something that I think should inform our management decisions and how we respond to conflicts like that. It's more maybe social science than ecology, but I think it's equally as important that we recognize and respond to those impacts. I won't touch the political question with a 10-foot stick.
Is it true we lose about 25% of the adult wolves every year? Sarcoptic mange, canine parvovirus, leishmaniasis, some are hit by cars. Occasionally wolves kill other wolves over territorial disputes, and yes, some are illegal shots. Is that pretty accurate?
It's usually a little bit higher than that. There's a lot of annual variation in wolf mortality, especially the occurrence of some of the diseases that you've talked about, but it's usually a little bit higher than that. In fact, the paper just came out 2 weeks ago that a nice survival analysis of the entire time series data, all this monitoring we've done, all the radio telemetry we've done on works. And I can't recall the specific survival estimate, but you're suggesting about 75% survival. It's a little bit lower than that. Mortality rates are a bit higher on average from year to year. It was 60%, something like that, survival.
Question? I know you all have, one online.
Line.
I hope it's not Debbie Pass. Why are you talking about me?
Back to the wolves in the endangered list. If the wolves are taken off the endangered list, why are they then hunted? Is it necessarily the case that they're hunted if they're not on the endangered list?
Right now in Wisconsin, it is. Our state statute in 2012, which was the last time wolves were delisted in Wisconsin, when they were delisted, our legislature passed a series of laws that essentially enabled the different approaches to management we would then engage in. And one of those dictates a state wolf harvest season whenever wolves are not on the federal endangered species list. So yes, under law right now, whenever wolves are not on the endangered species list, there will be a harvest season.
Are you aware of any incident where there was an attack by a wolf on a human?
Yes, but not in Wisconsin. There have been more than a couple reports of wolves acting strangely around people. A number have been investigated, but in terms of an attack on a person, I'm not aware of any in Wisconsin. But it certainly has occurred elsewhere. Very, very rare, exceedingly rare, to the point where the odds are almost zero, but it has been documented. As it has, honestly, for the other two species in my program, Cougars and black bears.
I've got two small questions. I was wondering if, I'm not up to date on the wild hogs in southwest Wisconsin, or if you've noticed any wolves predating them. And then, as an ecologist, I was wondering if you ever get out into the field anymore, or if you're only stuck in the office.
No, you can classify me as an office wad at this point. I honestly, most of my field time is on my personal time now. The way I operate right now with the DNR, it's mainly meeting rooms and office time, satisfying stuff. In terms of the feral pigs, that was an issue. How many of you remember, what, has it been 10, 12 years ago now, 8, 10, 12 years ago? An individual dissatisfied with the way the deer herd was being managed in Wisconsin took it upon himself to take his cattle trailer to Texas, load up a bunch of feral pigs, and he released them about 12 miles from my farm in Richland County down in Crawford County. They started to breed, and for a number of years there was some, I saw a cornfield, 40 acres of corn, entirely rooted up by a little herd of these feral pigs. But USDA APHIS Wildlife Services staff, if you ever want an animal captured and dealt with, those are the guys to call. They started to monitor the area for pig activity. They went out, used some trapping, some hunting methods, and as far as I know, there hasn't been a pig seen in that area in a few years. So they did a good job. Yep.
This is sort of a basic question, but how do you capture a wolf to put one of those radio collars on it?
With a toe hold trap. There's a high level of skill involved. Does anybody in the room trap recreationally? Do any trapping at all? Dean? So my son and I, my son Dell is 12, and since he was about 8, he and I have considered ourselves coyote and fox trappers. We have yet to catch a coyote or a fox or trapping. So these animals obviously have very well developed sensory systems, right? Their sense of smell. Capturing a wolf can be challenging. I've not done any wolf trapping myself, but it's essentially a standard toe hold or foot hold, leg hold trap. Sometimes they used to be called, but you use lures, attractants, olfactory attractants to try and draw them in. But there really has been an evolution over the last 25 years in trap design such that risk of injury is greatly minimized, right? The way the jaws come together, there's often a gap left in there, and normally this can be done very, very humanely. And once the wolf's in the trap, and the individual, say Ron, finds wolf in the trap, there are chemicals, drugs used to immobilize it for a short period of time so it can be handled safely for both the wolf and the scientist. The collar's put on, activated, and the wolf is released. So,
if the wolf's taken off the endangered species list but put on the threatened species list, is it true they still can't be hunted or trapped by the public, and yet Wildlife Services has the authority to take out problem wolves? I got one more.
As long as they're not endangered, it greatly expands our control options. I'd have to think. I'm not sure whether or not that would allow us to engage in things like recreational harvest. But I think the way this is going to play out, if wolves are delisted within the next couple of years, it's going to be congressionally mandated. It's not going to be through the typical delisting process as described in the Endangered Species Act. And if Congress does act to delist, they won't be downgraded to threatened. They will be delisted entirely, which then allows us to engage in the full suite
Another quick
management.
question. Isn't it true we pay up to $2,500 a dog if a wolf takes a dog?
That's correct, yep.
Question back here.
Yes, I have a question about that girl that you were chasing in high school. No, I'm sorry.
Go ahead and ask it. She's probably listening.
Was she kind of tall and, no. No, assuming that there's been some winter kill in the north, we had deep snow late in the year, lakes are still frozen, but assuming we have winter kill of deer, do wolves actually increase the level of predation because they have easier access to prey, or do they decrease it because those remaining deer have less competition?
They increase it. When deer struggle, when we've got deep snows in the north woods, deer struggle for a number of reasons, right? They can't get around, they can't easily access food, they can become severely nutritionally stressed, they become weakened, much easier for wolves to prey on. It's an important, so generally speaking, the harder the winter, snow depth being one of the big drivers, the easier life is for wolves. But what's interesting there is wolves then may take a considerable number of deer. The interpretation often is wolves are wiping out deer. The question is, would those deer have survived anyway? Right? So again, it's not as simple trying to figure out these predator-prey dynamics as you might first assume.
Yeah, is there any evidence of chronic wasting disease being transmitted, let's say, to any deer carnivore?
There was a student at UW-Madison a number of years ago that started looking at that, whether or not that prion, that altered protein, the CWD prion, was found in other species. And as far as I know, it hasn't, and anybody else can correct me if I'm wrong, it hasn't been identified in carnivores like wolves, etc. But it's been found just about everywhere else, in the soil, in the plants. So that CWD causing prion, even if we eradicate the deer, will remain in the environment for some period of time, which is concerning.
Speaking of CWD, with wolves predating on sick deer, we really don't know how bad CWD is up here then.
It's a great point. So you're suggesting the wolves might be providing some benefits to the deer herd?
Yes.
There's actually been some initial modeling work by a guy named Hobbs, suggesting that wolf predation, because they're generally seeking out the vulnerable animals, can limit the spread and distribution of diseases like chronic wasting disease. Something we don't have a good handle on. Again, this is just sort of a first stab at understanding that relationship and that system, but it's pretty appealing research that I think will be followed up on in the near future.
During the first wolf hunt, I think the original wolf management plan had a carrying capacity for Wisconsin for like 350. Was that about it? Somewhere right in there. And I know that was a big debate. Should we manage on this plan that was sort of maybe considered antiquated, because at the time, like you were saying, we didn't have 300 wolves in Wisconsin when that plan was written. So we had shown that the state actually does have a higher carrying capacity. I haven't been paying attention lately to the whole debate, but I'm wondering if the DNR has sorted that out and come up with a new revised scientifically based carrying capacity, or if we see delisting, are we going to hear the same old argument that we need to get down to that antiquated carrying capacity again?
Wow. Fantastic question. So the current wolf management plan, it's been amended a time or two, but the basic document was developed in 1999, okay? And at which point, if you remember my slide analogy, we had far fewer wolves than we do now. The plan goal was to maintain 350 wolves in the state. Now, you mentioned carrying capacity. Our understanding of what carrying capacity, the number of wolves we could house here in Wisconsin, has expanded as wolf numbers have expanded. We've come to understand that wolves could occupy far more range in Wisconsin than we initially thought back when the earliest models were run back in the 70s and 80s. So what carrying capacity is, some of the estimates put it at around 1,300 wolves. So if we can sustain 1,300 wolves in the state, what should our population goal be? And again, some people will say, well, then 1,300. Some people will say 0, right? Have we revised that estimate? So when wolves were delisted in 2012, the state had management authority. We started to revise that 1999 plan, and one of the big issues being debated was that goal. Is 350 wolves currently a suitable population goal? Does it address the impacts on agricultural producers? Does it allow long-term persistence of the wolf population, or some other goal? And they identified 4 options, one of which is 350, one of which is a goal that is non-numeric. Let's manage wolves in response to increases in depredations, increases in other conflicts, etc. Another goal is 650 wolves. Unfortunately, right before that plan was completed, wolves were relisted, and that document has not been finished yet. That'll be on my desk really quickly once wolves are delisted. But it's the issue, right? How many wolves and where do we want them? And we have yet to zero in on that.
When a wolf harvests the CWD infected deer, does that prion then pass through the scat? Does it potentially spread that prion to different locations as it comes through the digestive system, or does it completely go away in their digestive system?
I don't know the answer, but from what I know of CWD, again, anybody in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say yes. That prion is nearly indestructible. I would doubt any of the digestive enzymes are going to denature it. The acid's going to denature it. The stuff's got to get to what? 1,600 degrees before it denatures. There are enzymes that will denature it, but they're not the enzymes found in the mammalian digestive tract. So I would assume, yeah, it passes through them.
I had understood at one time that if there were coyotes in an area, you wouldn't have wolves, and I don't know if there's any scientific basis for that, and I'd appreciate a few reflections on the connection between those two.
Yeah, for a long time, and still, there's a belief that it probably works the opposite way, that there's a hierarchy, right? Just like in your 6th grade class, there was a hierarchy in the boys' locker room and the girls' locker room, right? In the carnivore community, in the canid community, there's also that hierarchy, and it's largely based on body size, right? You got the gray fox and red fox down here, little 8, 10, 12-pound animals. You got the coyote, a little bit larger, 18, 20, maybe 35-pound animals. Then you've got the wolf on top. And there tends to be some downward pressure. Where you've got coyotes, you tend to have far fewer red fox. They'll kill young red fox, they'll displace red fox. Generally speaking, where you have wolves, they'll do the same thing to coyotes. There's been historic research that shows that coyotes sort of hang out in lower numbers in the margins of wolf pack territories where they're not likely to encounter wolves. Interestingly enough, and we were just talking about this earlier today, in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin, we've not really seen the coyote population decline as our wolves have become established. Why? I don't know. But here, okay. If I can go off on another little tangent. I mentioned that predator-prey dynamics. It's one of my interests, one of the things I've grabbed onto in the wildlife field. One of the things we see is coyotes have colonized new areas. Who remembers when we really didn't have coyotes in large parts of Wisconsin? When I was a kid, we would go out trapping. We caught lots and lots of red fox. We never coyotes weren't there. In the late 80s, coyote numbers increased, right? How many people, let me ask you this, how many people in this room love coyotes? Well, good, a fairly decent number. I get laughed at in most cases when I ask that question. As coyotes have expanded their range, people tend to view them as another predator on the landscape, and they assume that declines in pheasants, ruffed grouse, rabbits, whatever, are due to all these new coyotes. There's cool research that shows, given those relationships amongst canids I was talking about, where you have coyotes, you can actually have more ground nesting game birds. The birds that lay eggs on the ground may benefit from the presence of coyotes. Why? Because there's fewer fox. Coyotes are going to kill feral cats, young raccoons, possums. I find walking my farm, I find possums pretty frequently that have been killed and eaten by coyotes. Where you have coyotes, you can have far fewer total predators on the landscape because they're larger, their home ranges, their territories are much larger. One pair of coyotes may occupy a range that instead would be occupied by 8 or 10 red fox families. Some cool research indicated, well, the initial study was done on ducks out in the Dakotas, where they had coyotes 2.5 times more duck nests hatched eggs than where they didn't because there were so many red fox. So it's a tangent, but it's kind of interesting stuff to think about.
Any other questions? Oh, one online.
A question online. A few years ago, there was a hunting season for wolves. Was there any science being done, any research being done that people learned anything from that last hunting go-round?
Yeah, well, I think what we learned as an agency is we can implement controlled wolf harvest season to make sure that our harvest isn't excessive. Regardless of whether or not you think there are not enough or too many wolves out there, 1,000 animals is not a lot when you start talking about removals, harvest seasons, active management. So harvest has to be controlled, especially for a species that if it dips down, it's going to be relisted again, right, here in Wisconsin. So what did we learn? We learned we can implement a season, we can monitor harvest, we can close the season when we need to make sure harvests long-term are sustainable. In terms of research, if you look at that slide, the increasing wolf population, there was one dip in 2012 and 2013. That was due to harvest. That was due to our ability to implement these management techniques, harvest season, lethal control of problem wolves, etc. So we also learned that if we want to, if we decide as a public that we want some number fewer wolves than we have, we can use harvest as a tool to bring the population down.
Any more questions? Oh, okay, no.
Several years ago, we were at the Discovery Center, and there was a program on wolves, and I don't remember the speaker's name, but the impact of that, or what I remember about it, was the thought that we really needed to manage the wolf population across state borders, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, because wolves don't know where the borders are. And I wondered if there's been progress in that, if there is any intentionality about doing that.
Absolutely. I may have mentioned earlier the Upper Great Lakes distinct population segment. The federal government views Wisconsin wolves as part of this broader multi-state and province population segment. And we recognize that too. We coordinate with colleagues in Michigan DNR, Minnesota DNR. Their populations are also connected to populations north of the border in Canada. And you're right, wolves don't care unless they're Packer fans or they like brats. They don't care where they are. They're all part of one broader population. From a management point of view, it's important to recognize that if we make decisions about where we don't want wolves, say some northern Wisconsin tiers of county, we're creating a gap between our wolves and their wolves that may influence genetic exchange, recolonization of low populations, things like that. So yeah, those types of linkages are really important to recognize and incorporate in our management.
So I know that we have a few moose up here, kind of little pockets of them, and every now and then we hear of them falling, a fatality because of their biggest predator, probably the automobile. But have any of them died in, or known cases in Wisconsin where they've died from the brainworm transmitted by deer?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I know that brainworm is what limits the southern distribution of moose, or it's believed to. It's a worm that white-tailed deer can have, but it doesn't impact them. Where white-tailed deer and moose sort of coexist, that worm transmitted to moose is lethal in most cases. So generally speaking, yeah, that's what's limiting moose, or maybe one of the things limiting moose in Wisconsin. Whether or not we've identified that as a mortality cause for these individual moose that wander into the state, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Any others?
Debbie Pash might know if we could get her.
Are you familiar with what the elk population is right now in northwestern Wisconsin?
In the Clam Lake area?
Clam Lake area,
It's healthy enough that it's going to be supporting our first, in what, 100+ years, elk hunt, right? You guys may have heard that the application period is open for 5 elk tags that are going to be given out. I don't know the most recent numbers, but I know that some additional elk have been brought up the last couple of years from Kentucky to augment the population near Clam Lake, and also the newer herd that's been established down in Jackson County. So the herd's healthy, signs that it's growing. And if you want my take on what's going to happen, for a population to establish, a small population has lots of challenges. Losing just a few individuals can keep it from tipping upward. But once it starts, oftentimes, this is what we saw with wolves in the state, right? We bounced around like this for, we've only got 12 left, 14, 16. We've got distemper, we're down. Once they gained population inertia, it's called. And I anticipate, and I'm going to cover this up because this is Scott Walter, right? This is not a DNR stance. But I anticipate once that population really establishes, starts to gain that inertia, we're going to see a very healthy elk population. I am so excited about that. You remember all the excitement about turkeys in Wisconsin? I know that excitement has been tempered since then, but this sort of large, glorious bird that had been extirpated from the state now is back. It's a great thing. The elk story, I think, my view, is more dramatic and should be more compelling as a wildlife success story than turkeys or anything else. I live on Elk Creek in Richland County. My great-great-great-grandfather may have harvested and ate an elk in Richland County. It's been a century since we could talk about harvesting an elk in a state. It is so cool. What do you think it would look like if a DNR employee drew one of those 5 tags?
All right, we have one more question over there.
All right then. Okay. Hi there, everybody. I've heard that grizzlies are described as a keystone species in the Cascades area. So what about around here?
Well, grizzly bears?
No, a keystone species.
Oh, what's the keystone species around here? Thanks. Grizzlies, by the way, there's some debate about this, were probably native to Wisconsin, mainly the savannas in the southern part of the state. But wolves are certainly a keystone species. The definition of a keystone species is any animal that has an impact on community structure beyond its abundance, right? So anything, if you pull it out, things change. So wolves, through their impacts on prey species, right, regulatory impacts, the food web, et cetera, are certainly a keystone species. You may have read about The way the entire community, wildlife community, has adjusted subsequent to the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, that's the type of impacts that wolves can have on these systems.